Imagine standing in a trench at midnight, hearing 1,000 voices screaming through the darkness, rushing toward you with fixed bayonets. Now imagine facing that human tsunami with nothing but a pump-action shotgun and 9 rounds of buckshot. What kind of warfare drives men to charge straight into death? And what weapon could possibly stop them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1944, on a forgotten island in the Pacific, American Marines discovered that sometimes the most primitive weapon becomes the most devastating. The Japanese had their ancient warrior code. The Americans had 12-gauge shells loaded with 9 lead pellets each. When these two forces collided in the mud and blood of Tinian Island, warfare revealed its most brutal face. This is the story of when honor met horror, when tradition crashed against innovation, and when the night itself became a killing ground. The year was 1944, and the Pacific Theater had transformed into a sprawling cemetery of ambitions. From the volcanic shores of Iwo Jima to the dense jungles of Guadalcanal, every island became a fortress, every beach a potential graveyard. The Japanese Empire, once an unstoppable tide sweeping across Asia, now found itself retreating yard by yard, island by island, leaving behind shattered divisions and burned-out garrisons. Yet even in defeat, the imperial army clung to doctrines forged centuries before, when samurai walked the earth and death in battle was the highest calling a warrior could answer. The American advance had been methodical, crushing, inevitable. Island hopping, they called it, a strategy that bypassed heavily fortified positions and instead seized strategically vital specks of coral and rock. Each victory brought the bombers closer to the Japanese home islands. Each captured airstrip meant another launching point for raids that would turn cities into infernos. The mathematics of war favored the United States overwhelmingly. American factories churned out tanks, aircraft, and ammunition at a pace that left Japanese planners in quiet despair. Where Japan could build 1 carrier, America launched 10. Where Japanese soldiers made do with dwindling supplies, American Marines landed with such abundance that they sometimes discarded perfectly good equipment simply because newer models had arrived. But numbers alone never told the complete story of war. The Japanese military, strangled by shrinking resources and confronting inevitable defeat, doubled down on something that could not be manufactured in factories or shipped across oceans. They doubled down on spirit, on the willingness to die, on the belief that one man hurling himself at the enemy with absolute commitment could achieve what 1,000 shells might not. This philosophy, ancient and uncompromising, had roots that stretched back through centuries of Japanese military tradition. The code they lived by had a name whispered with reverence in training camps and barracks across the empire. Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that death was preferable to surrender, that shame was worse than annihilation, that a soldier's life belonged not to himself but to his emperor and his ancestors. During the Meiji era, this code had been systematically revived and weaponized, transformed from feudal custom into military doctrine. By the time war erupted across the Pacific, young Japanese soldiers absorbed these teachings from childhood. They learned that to die in battle was to achieve immortality, that their spirits would reside forever in the Yasukuni shrine, that surrender was a stain not just on themselves but on their families for generations. When Allied forces began their relentless push toward the Japanese homeland, military commanders reached into this deep well of cultural conditioning and pulled forth a tactic that Western minds struggled to comprehend. If conventional warfare meant trading casualties for territory, and if Japan could no longer win that exchange, then perhaps unconventional warfare, warfare that weaponized the human body itself, could turn the tide. The Banzai charge, named for the war cry that accompanied it, became the embodiment of this philosophy. Thousands of voices screaming Tenno Hika Banzai, long live the emperor, as waves of soldiers rushed forward, bayonets fixed, grenades clutched, embracing death as readily as breath. These charges were not random acts of desperation, though desperation certainly fueled them. They were calculated tactics designed to exploit perceived weaknesses in American psychology. Japanese commanders believed that Americans, comfortable and individualistic, valued their own lives too highly. They believed that if enough Japanese soldiers threw themselves at American lines with suicidal fury, the defenders would break, would flee, would abandon their positions rather than face the psychological horror of men who refused to stop coming even as they died. The Banzai charge was psychological warfare wearing the mask of military strategy, an attempt to shatter enemy morale through sheer, unrelenting violence. The Pacific Islands where these tactics flourished shared certain characteristics. Dense jungle vegetation provided cover for assembling troops. Rugged terrain offered concealment until the last possible moment. Narrow beaches and confined battlefields meant that superior American firepower could be partially negated by forcing close-quarters combat. On Saipan, at Tarawa, across Peleliu, Japanese forces had launched Banzai charges with varying degrees of success. Sometimes they overran positions, butchering Marines in their foxholes before dying themselves. Sometimes they were mowed down wholesale, bodies piling in grotesque heaps before they reached American lines. But always, they terrified. Always, they left survivors with nightmares that would last lifetimes. American military planners studied these attacks with a mixture of respect and revulsion. They recognized the courage it took to charge into machine gun fire. They also recognized the waste, the senselessness of tactics that guaranteed the death of the attacker regardless of outcome. Intelligence officers compiled reports, analyzing patterns, trying to predict when and where the next human wave might crash against their defenses. What they discovered was troubling. Banzai charges typically came at night, when darkness amplified fear and confusion. They came when Japanese forces were cornered, when supply lines had been severed, when defeat was inevitable. They came as a final gesture, a last throw of the dice before annihilation. The weapons Americans carried had been designed for different kinds of warfare. The M1 Garand rifle, reliable and powerful, excelled at medium-range engagements. The Browning automatic rifle provided suppressive fire. Machine guns created killing zones that could shred advancing infantry. But all of these weapons shared a weakness when confronting a Banzai charge. They required aiming, required picking targets from a screaming mass of humanity rushing through darkness. They required reload time that might not exist when the enemy closed to arm's length. And most critically, they required psychological composure that could evaporate when faced with hundreds of men willing to die just to kill one defender. Some Marines, veterans of previous island campaigns, began improvising. They requisitioned weapons that the military establishment considered obsolete, relics from earlier wars that had been mothballed in armories and forgotten. Among these weapons was the trench gun, the combat shotgun, a weapon that had earned a fearsome reputation during the First World War. The Germans had called it inhumane, had protested its use, had threatened to execute any American soldier captured with one. That protest alone spoke volumes about the weapon's effectiveness. The shotgun that found its way to the Pacific was not a precision instrument. It was a blunt object given lethal form, a weapon that valued spread over accuracy, that turned every pull of the trigger into a swarm of metal. The standard load was 12-gauge buckshot, 9 lead pellets weighing roughly an ounce combined, propelled by black powder at velocities that could punch through flesh and bone with ease. At close range, within 15 yards, those 9 pellets spread into a pattern roughly the size of a dinner plate. Any human body intersecting that pattern would be catastrophically damaged, vital organs shredded, bones shattered, blood vessels torn open in ways that made survival impossible. Military bureaucracy initially resisted issuing shotguns widely. They were not standard infantry weapons. They lacked. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Range. They required specialized ammunition that complicated supply chains already stretched thin across thousands of miles of ocean. But the Marines who had faced Banzai charges did not care about bureaucracy. They cared about staying alive. They cared about having a weapon that could stop a charging enemy before he planted a bayonet in their chest or detonated a grenade in their foxhole. And so, quietly, unofficially, shotguns began appearing in greater numbers, passed from veteran units to replacement troops, hoarded like treasures, cleaned obsessively because a malfunction meant death. The island of Tinian sat in the Marianas Chain, a flat plateau of coral and scrub brush that Japanese forces had fortified heavily. Its airfields, once operational, would put American B-29 bombers within easy striking distance of Tokyo itself. Capturing Tinian was not optional. It was essential. The invasion began in July 1944, with the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hitting the beaches under covering fire from battleships whose guns had been hammering Japanese positions for days. The initial landings went better than expected. American forces pushed inland, securing beachheads, establishing supply dumps, bringing ashore tanks and artillery. But the Japanese garrison, over 8,000 men commanded by officers who had already accepted their own deaths, had no intention of defending every inch of coastline. They withdrew to prepared positions in the island's interior, to caves and bunkers. Reinforced with concrete and sandbags, to terrain that negated American firepower advantages. They waited, conserving ammunition, conserving strength, knowing that their opportunity would come when darkness fell and confusion reigned. Among the Marine units advancing across Tinian was a rifle company composed largely of replacements, young men fresh from training camps in California, mixed with a cadre of veterans who had survived Tarawa and Saipan. These veterans recognized the signs. They saw the lack of resistance during daylight. They noted the way Japanese defenders seemed to melt away rather than stand and fight. They knew what was coming. And they made sure that every man who could handle one received a shotgun and as many shells as they could carry. Private First Class Samuel Ortega from Corpus Christi had joined the Marines 6 months earlier, drawn by propaganda posters and a desire to escape the poverty of Depression-era Texas. His training had been thorough but theoretical. He could field strip a rifle blindfolded. He could throw a grenade with reasonable accuracy. He had never killed another human being. The veterans in his platoon recognized his inexperience immediately, saw it in the way he held his weapon, in the questions he asked, in the slight tremor in his hands when artillery rumbled in the distance. Sergeant William Hutchins, a leathery man from Oregon who had survived 3 island campaigns, took Ortega aside the evening before the expected attack. They sat in a shell hole, smoking cigarettes that glowed like fireflies in the gathering dusk, and Hutchins explained realities that no training manual covered. He explained that when the Banzai charge came, it would not resemble anything Ortega had imagined. It would be noise and darkness and chaos. Men would be screaming in languages Ortega did not understand, rushing forward without regard for their own survival, intent only on killing before they died. The natural human instinct would be to flee, to abandon the position, to run into the jungle and hide. Hutchins explained, with a gentleness that contradicted his scarred hands and flat eyes, that giving in to that instinct meant death. The only way to survive was to stand, to fire, to keep firing until the weapon ran dry, and then to reload and fire again. Hutchins handed Ortega a shotgun, a Winchester Model 1897 trench gun with a perforated barrel shroud and a bayonet lug that made the weapon look more medieval than modern. The wood stock was scratched and dented from years of service. The metal showed spots of rust despite constant cleaning. But the action worked smoothly, and when Hutchins demonstrated the slam-fire technique, holding the trigger down and working the pump, the weapon spat empty shells so quickly they seemed to blur in the air. The ammunition came in cardboard boxes, each shell as thick as a man's thumb, red plastic casings stamped with black lettering. Hutchins showed Ortega how to load the tubular magazine, how to keep the safety off because there would be no time to fumble for it in darkness, how to aim low because the recoil would drive the barrel upward and the spread of buckshot would compensate for any lack of precision. Most importantly, Hutchins explained the effective range. Beyond 20 yards, buckshot lost its lethality, the pellets spreading too wide, losing velocity, capable of wounding but not stopping a determined attacker. Closer than 5 yards, the pellets had not spread enough, acting almost like a single projectile, devastating but wasting the weapon's inherent advantage. The sweet spot was 10 to 15 yards, close enough that the buckshot pattern covered a man's entire torso, far enough that multiple attackers could be engaged before they closed to bayonet range. As night fell over Tinian, the temperature dropped slightly, bringing relief from the oppressive daytime heat. The Marines dug in, establishing a defensive perimeter that curved across the island's interior, anchored by machine gun positions and interlocking fields of fire. Foxholes were deep, scraped into coral that resisted every shovel stroke. Men paired up, one sleeping while the other watched, though few actually slept. The darkness was absolute, no moon, clouds obscuring the stars, the kind of darkness that played tricks on the mind, transforming bushes into advancing soldiers and empty spaces into lurking threats. Ortega sat in his foxhole beside Hutchins, the shotgun across his knees, a bandolier of shells draped over his shoulder. Other Marines nearby made small noises, checking weapons, whispering nervously, trying to stay alert despite exhaustion. Artillery rumbled somewhere to the south, distant thunder that rolled across the island in waves. Occasionally a flare arced overhead, casting harsh white light that created ink-black shadows and revealed nothing of value before sputtering out and plunging everything back into darkness. The attack, when it came, announced itself first as sound. A low murmur from the Japanese lines, growing louder, resolving into voices chanting in unison. The chant built, amplified by hundreds of throats, becoming a roar that seemed to shake the air itself. Then came the screaming, high-pitched and inhuman, mixed with the clash of equipment and the pounding of feet against coral. Officers barked orders, their voices barely audible over the rising cacophony. Flares shot upward, popping overhead with magnesium brilliance, and in their light the Marines saw what was coming. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers, perhaps 1,000, packed shoulder to shoulder, surged forward in a human avalanche. They carried rifles with bayonets fixed, but many had discarded their firearms entirely, clutching swords, machetes, sharpened bamboo spears, anything that could kill at arm's length. Some wore full uniforms, but others had stripped to loincloths, their bodies painted white to make themselves more visible to their comrades in the darkness. They ran with a peculiar gait, hunched forward, arms pumping, screaming continuously, a sound that bypassed rational thought and triggered something primal in the men facing them. The American line erupted. Machine guns opened up first, their tracers drawing red lines through the darkness, stitching patterns across the charging mass. Men fell, tumbling forward, tripping those behind them, but the charge did not slow. Rifles cracked in ragged volleys, M1 Garens firing their distinctive 8-round clips before ejecting them with a metallic ping. Grenades arced outward, detonating with sharp cracks that briefly illuminated craters filled with torn bodies. But still they came, closing the distance, 70 yards, 60, 50, the sound of their voices drowning out everything else. Hutchins stood in the foxhole, shotgun at his shoulder, waiting. Discipline born from experience kept him from firing too early, from wasting ammunition on targets still beyond effective range. Beside him, Ortega struggled to control his breathing, struggled not to simply empty his weapon into the darkness and hope for the best. The charging Japanese soldiers were close enough now that individual faces became visible in the flare light, mouths open in screams, eyes wide with something beyond mere courage, perhaps a kind of ecstasy that came from embracing death so completely. At 30 yards, Hutchins fired. The shotgun roared, a sound deeper and more visceral than a rifle, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. The lead attacker, a young soldier wielding a katana overhead, simply ceased to exist from the waist up, his body transformed into red mist and falling meat. Hutchins worked the pump, fired again, the slam-fire technique turning his weapon into a continuous thunder. Each shot removed a man from existence, the buckshot spreading just enough to catch not only the intended target but those immediately beside him. Bodies collapsed, some dead before they hit the ground, others thrashing and screaming, intestines spilling from shredded abdomens, faces obliterated into unrecognizable ruin. Ortega fired without conscious thought, pure instinct taking over where training failed. His first shot went high, Buckshot screaming over the attackers' heads. His second hit center mass on a charging soldier 10 yards away, lifting the man off his feet and slamming him backward into those behind him. The recoil bruised Ortega's shoulder, but adrenaline masked the pain. He pumped, fired, the mechanical repetition anchoring him as chaos exploded around him. The Marines with shotguns created gaps in the charging line, zones where bodies piled so quickly that those following had to slow, had to climb over the dead and dying, presenting themselves as easier targets. The machine guns, which had been firing continuously, began to overheat, barrels glowing red in the darkness, some jamming, their crews frantically working to clear stoppages. But the shotguns kept firing, methodical, devastating, each trigger pull erasing a human life with such totality that those killed often did not realize they were dead until they tried to take another step and discovered their legs no longer existed. Some Japanese soldiers broke through, hurdling the last few yards, leaping into foxholes with bayonets leading. Hand-to-hand combat erupted, brutal and intimate, men grappling in mud turned slippery with blood, using knives, entrenching tools, bare hands, fighting with the desperate fury of animals cornered and afraid. A soldier landed in Ortega's foxhole, his bayonet aimed at Ortega's throat, and only Hutchins' intervention, the sergeant driving his combat knife into the attacker's kidney, saved the young Marine's life. The Japanese soldier collapsed, gurgling, and Hutchins pushed him aside without ceremony, already turning back to face the next wave. The charge lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though to those enduring it, time became meaningless. When it finally broke, when the surviving attackers melted back into the darkness, the silence that followed felt almost physical, pressing down on eardrums abused by continuous gunfire. Men stood in their positions, weapons still pointed outward, bodies shaking with adrenaline crash, minds struggling to process what they had just endured. The smell hit next, a combination of burned powder, open bowels, and blood, so thick it seemed to coat the throat. Flares continued to pop overhead, revealing a landscape transformed. The coral ground that had been pale and relatively clean now looked like an abattoir floor. Bodies lay everywhere, some intact, most not, scattered across the approach like discarded dolls. Many still moved, wounded men crawling, crying out in Japanese, pleading for help that would not come. American policy forbade approaching wounded enemy soldiers. Too many Marines had been killed by men feigning injury who detonated grenades when someone came close. And so the wounded were left, their cries gradually weakening, until dawn brought corpsmen who would finish what combat had started. Ortega stared at a shotgun, the barrel still warm, smoke wisping from the breech. 9 shells remained in his bandolier from the 40 he had started with. 31 shots fired. He tried to count how many men he had killed and found he could not. The attacks had blurred together into a continuous nightmare of muzzle flashes and falling bodies. Hutchins, noticing Ortega's 1,000-yard stare, reached over and gently took the shotgun from his hands, propping it against the foxhole wall. The sergeant's voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle, the tone a father might use with a traumatized child. He told Ortega that the shaking would pass, that the nausea was normal, that every man felt this way after their first real combat. He did not tell Ortega that the dreams would never stop, that decades later the young Marine would wake screaming, convinced he could still hear those voices in the darkness, still smell that particular combination of death and cordite. Some truths serve no purpose. Dawn came slowly, the sun rising over an island transformed by violence. The Marine line had held, the Banzai charge repulsed, but the cost revealed itself in daylight. American casualties were lighter than they might have been, the shotguns having proven their worth, but there were still bodies in foxholes, Marines who had been overrun in the brief moments when attackers broke through. Corpsmen moved among the positions, treating wounded, marking dead, their faces professionally blank as they worked. The Japanese casualties defied counting. Intelligence officers, walking the battlefield with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces against the stench, estimated between 800 and 1,000 enemy dead in the immediate assault zone. They lay in heaps, some positions showing bodies stacked 3 deep where machine gun and shotgun fire had been concentrated. The wounds told their own story. Men killed by rifles showed single-entry wounds, usually to the chest or head. Men killed by machine guns showed multiple hits in tight groups. But men killed by shotguns looked as if they had been attacked by wild animals, their bodies shredded, limbs missing, torsos opened so completely that internal organs spilled onto the ground. Graves registration teams, wearing gas masks against the smell, began the grim work of clearing the battlefield. Japanese dead were dragged to mass graves, bulldozed into pits and covered with coral. Personal effects, swords, photographs, letters, were collected and catalogued, though whether they would ever reach families in Japan seemed doubtful. American dead received more ceremony, wrapped in ponchos, tagged, and buried with rifle volleys and the playing of taps, though even these services felt perfunctory given the scale of dying that surrounded them. The Marines who had held the line were pulled back for rest, replacement units moving forward to continue the advance. Ortega and his platoon trudged toward the rear, men too exhausted to speak, moving like automatons, their uniforms stiff with dried blood that was not their own. Someone had set up field kitchens, and they received hot food for the first time in days, but few had appetite. They ate mechanically, refueling bodies that felt alien and distant. Hutchins sat apart from the others, cleaning his shotgun with methodical precision. He field-stripped the weapon completely, wiping down every component, checking for carbon buildup, rust, any defect that might cause a malfunction. The maintenance was unnecessary, the weapon had functioned flawlessly, but his hands needed something to do, needed the familiar ritual to anchor him to sanity. Around him, other veterans performed similar tasks, their silence speaking louder than any words. The shotguns themselves became objects of fascination and dread. Marines who had not been part of the defense walked the battlefield afterward, seeing the results, understanding in visceral terms what those weapons could accomplish. Requests for shotguns multiplied, flooding up through the chain of command, until supply officers scrambled to locate more of the weapons in depots scattered across the Pacific. The military establishment, which had viewed shotguns as specialized tools of limited utility, suddenly found itself dealing with a weapon that had proven decisive in the kind of close-quarters nightmare that characterized Pacific Island warfare. But with that effectiveness came psychological weight. Men who carried shotguns found themselves changed by what those weapons enabled them to do. Killing with a rifle maintained certain distance, the target often falling unseen, death an abstract consequence of squeezing a trigger. Killing with a shotgun was intimate, immediate, impossible to abstract. The buckshot erased men at ranges. Where their faces were clearly visible, where their final expressions, terror or determination or resignation, burned into the memory of whoever pulled the trigger. Some Marines requested reassignment after using shotguns in combat, claiming they preferred any other weapon. Others, like Hutchins, accepted the shotgun as necessary evil, a tool that maximized their chances of survival regardless of the nightmares it purchased. The battle for Tinian continued for another week, Japanese resistance collapsing sector by sector as American forces advanced. More Banzai charges came, smaller now, company-sized rather than regimental, desperate last stands by men who knew the island was lost but could not bring themselves to surrender. Each charge met the same result, torn apart by concentrated fire, with shotguns creating kill zones that resembled butcher shops more than battlefields. By early August, Tinian was declared secure. The cost had been significant but not catastrophic by Pacific War standards. American casualties numbered in the hundreds, Japanese losses exceeded 8,000 with virtually the entire garrison killed. The island's airfields were quickly repaired and expanded, and within months, B-29 super fortresses began using them as staging bases for raids against the Japanese home islands. It was from Tinian, in fact, that the aircraft carrying atomic bombs would eventually depart, though none of the Marines who fought there in the summer of 1944 knew that history was about to render their sacrifices, both American and Japanese, into footnotes of a much larger horror. For Samuel Ortega, the war continued. He participated in the invasion of Iwo Jima, where Banzai charges were rare because Japanese defenders had learned to avoid them, choosing instead to fight from fortified positions that forced Americans to winkle them out yard by yard. He survived that battle too, though the Ortega who came home to Texas in late 1945 bore little resemblance to the boy who had enlisted. He never spoke about the war, never attended reunions, never joined veteran organizations. When he died in 1987, his children found a footlocker in the attic containing his uniform, medals he had never displayed, and a photograph of young men in Marine uniforms, most of whom had not survived to see peace. William Hutchins made it home to Oregon but found that home no longer fit. He drifted from job to job, town to town, unable to settle, unable to shake the conviction that he was still in that foxhole on Tinian, still hearing those screams, still pulling that trigger. In 1952, he walked into the forest near Crater Lake and did not come back. Searchers found his body 3 weeks later, a single rifle shot to the head, the weapon lying beside him. His suicide note was brief, apologizing to his family, explaining that he had died on Tinian 8 years earlier and his body had simply taken this long to realize it. The shotguns themselves faded from military use after the war. The Marine Corps retained some for specialized purposes, but the weapon never achieved the status of standard infantry equipment. Modern warfare moved toward longer ranges, toward precision and technology, and the brutal effectiveness of buckshot at 10 yards seemed antiquated, a relic from a more savage age. Yet every generation of Marines learned about Tinian, about the night the Banzai charges met 12-gauge buckshot, about the weapon that had proven more effective than machine guns or rifles at stopping men who had already accepted death. In Japan, the Banzai charges entered national memory as both glory and tragedy, examples of supreme sacrifice that also highlighted the futility of tactics that guaranteed the death of those who employed them. Survivors of the Pacific War, those who had participated in or witnessed the charges, rarely discussed them publicly. The shame of defeat mixed with the horror of methods that had turned young men into expendable ammunition, creating a silence that lasted generations. Only in recent decades have Japanese historians begun examining these tactics with critical eyes, questioning whether the emphasis on death over life, on sacrifice over survival, had served the nation or merely fed it to the fire. The clash between Banzai charges and American shotguns represented something more than tactical innovation meeting traditional warfare. It represented a collision of philosophies, of cultures, of fundamentally different approaches to the value of human life. The Japanese military, shaped by centuries of samurai tradition, viewed individual life as subordinate to collective honor, saw death in battle as the ultimate fulfillment of a warrior's purpose. The American military, shaped by democratic individualism, viewed each soldier's life as valuable, sought to minimize casualties, and embraced whatever weapons or tactics kept their men alive. Neither philosophy was inherently superior or inferior. Both produced acts of extraordinary courage. Both led men to endure horrific circumstances. But when they collided in the darkness of Tinian, the practical advantages favored the Americans. The shotgun, brutal and inelegant, proved more effective than the katana, more reliable than the bayonet charge, more suited to the reality of Pacific Island warfare where combat often devolved into desperate close-quarters struggles where victory went to whoever could put the most metal into the most bodies in the shortest time. The lessons learned on Tinian influenced American military doctrine for decades. The value of having diverse weapon systems, of matching firepower to tactical situations, of not being bound by traditional notions of what constituted proper military equipment, all of these principles were reinforced by the effectiveness of combat shotguns against human wave attacks. When American forces found themselves fighting in Vietnam's jungles 2 decades later, shotguns reappeared, used by tunnel rats and point men, by anyone who understood that sometimes the oldest weapons proved the most effective. The human cost, however, could not be calculated in doctrine or weapons procurement. The men who stood in those foxholes, who pulled those triggers, who watched human beings disintegrate under the impact of buckshot, paid a price that military efficiency reports never captured. Many, like Hutchins, could not bear that price, could not reconcile the necessity of what they had done with their ability to continue living. Others, like Ortega, simply locked the memories away, building walls around the trauma, refusing to acknowledge the nightmares that never truly stopped. The Japanese families who received death notices, who lit incense before small shrines, who wore mourning for sons who had charged into American guns, paid their own price. They had been told their sons died as heroes, had sacrificed themselves for emperor and nation. What they were not told was that those sacrifices had accomplished nothing strategically, that the charges had been militarily futile, that their sons had died in a tactical doctrine born more from desperation than from any reasonable chance of success. The knowledge might not have lessened their grief, but it would have complicated the narrative of glorious sacrifice that the government provided as consolation. In the end, the story of Banzai charges meeting American shotguns is not a story of one side's superiority over another. It is a story of how war forces impossible choices, of how cultural values can lead men to embrace tactics that ensure their own destruction, of how other men, faced with such tactics, will use whatever tools necessary to survive. The shotgun was neither humane nor particularly sophisticated. It was simply effective, and in the calculus of combat, effectiveness is the only measure that matters. The ghosts of Tinian remain, though few remember them now. The island, returned to peaceful use, shows little evidence of the carnage that occurred there. The mass graves have been paved over or forgotten. The airfields, once hosting bombers that would help end the war, now see only occasional civilian traffic. The jungles have reclaimed much of what battle scarred, growing over foxholes and pillboxes, covering the blood-soaked coral with new life. But in the memories of those who survived, in the letters and diaries preserved in archives, in the official records that document what happened in clinical language stripped of emotion, the truth persists. For a few terrible hours on a Pacific island in the summer of 1944, ancient warrior traditions crashed against modern industrial warfare, and the result was a slaughter that neither side had truly wanted but both had made inevitable through their choices. The Banzai charges came. The shotguns answered. And in the morning, the living counted the dead and wondered if any victory could be worth such cost. The aftermath of that first major Banzai charge on Tinian rippled outward through both military hierarchies and the hearts of individual soldiers in ways that would reshape combat doctrine and haunt personal lives for generations. Within hours of the battle's conclusion, intelligence officers began compiling reports, their typewriters clacking in field tents still reeking of diesel fuel and sweat. They documented casualty ratios, ammunition expenditure rates, and weapon effectiveness statistics, translating the night's horror into numbers that commanders could analyze. The statistics told a story that contradicted decades of military orthodoxy. Traditional military wisdom held that shotguns were antiquated, suitable perhaps for guarding prisoners or clearing buildings but irrelevant to modern battlefield tactics. The data from Tinian obliterated that assumption. Where rifle-armed Marines had achieved kill rates of roughly one enemy soldier per 3 to 4 rounds fired, shotgun-armed defenders had achieved ratios approaching 1 kill per 1.5 rounds. The mathematics were undeniable and brutal. At ranges under 20 yards, the combat shotgun had proven 3 times more lethal than the standard issue M1 Garand, 5 times more effective than the Browning automatic rifle, and nearly as devastating as a well-positioned machine gun without requiring a crew or fixed emplacement. Staff officers studying these figures recognized implications that extended far beyond a single night's fighting. The Pacific War had become a grinding succession of island assaults, each one forcing Marines to dig in against defenders who increasingly favored suicidal close-range attacks. If shotguns could multiply defensive effectiveness by such margins, they represented not merely an alternative weapon but a potential solution to one of the theater's most persistent tactical problems. Requisitions flooded back to the United States, requests for thousands of shotguns, for tens of thousands of shells, for training programs that would prepare Marines to use these weapons effectively. The supply chain, never designed to handle such demands, strained under the sudden pressure. Winchester and Remington factories, already operating at maximum capacity producing rifles and machine guns, received urgent contracts to manufacture combat shotguns. Engineers dusted off blueprints from the Great War, updating the designs with minor modifications that reflected 3 decades of metallurgical advances. Production lines were retooled, workers trained on new assembly procedures, and within months the first shipments began arriving in the Pacific, crated weapons accompanied by cases of 12-gauge shells stenciled with warnings about their intended purpose. But weapons alone could not address the psychological dimensions of what had occurred on Tinian. The Marines who had survived that night carried scars that no medical corpsman could treat. They had crossed a threshold that separated theoretical understanding of combat from visceral knowledge of what one human being could do to another when necessity demanded it. The act of aiming a shotgun at another man's torso and pulling the trigger, of watching that man transformed instantly from a living threat into scattered meat, created a psychological burden that accumulated with each repetition. Some men handled this burden through dark humor, through jokes that would have been incomprehensible to civilians, through a gallows camaraderie that acknowledged what they had done while refusing to examine it too closely. They gave their shotguns nicknames, referred to them with the kind of affectionate profanity that soldiers reserve for equipment they trust absolutely. They told stories that emphasized the weapon's effectiveness while carefully avoiding detailed descriptions of what that effectiveness looked like when applied to human flesh. The laughter in these conversations was real but brutal, a defense mechanism against memories that threatened to overwhelm if confronted directly. Others withdrew into silence, performing their duties mechanically while something behind their eyes grew distant and cold. They cleaned their weapons obsessively, checked and rechecked ammunition counts, maintained combat readiness with a perfectionism that their sergeants initially praised before recognizing it as a symptom of deeper disturbance. These were men who had seen something in themselves that they had not known existed, a capacity for violence that civilization's thin veneer had hidden, and they no longer trusted the person they had become. The Japanese military, gathering its own intelligence from survivors and interrogated prisoners, drew different conclusions from the Banzai charge's failure. Some commanders acknowledged that the tactic had proven ineffective against prepared defenses equipped with automatic weapons and, increasingly, with shotguns. They recommended modifications, suggesting smaller-scale infiltration attacks rather than mass charges, emphasizing stealth over shock, accepting that the days of overwhelming American positions through sheer numbers and willingness to die had passed. But other officers, particularly those most deeply invested in the spiritual dimensions of Bushido, rejected such pragmatic assessments. They argued that the Banzai charges had failed not because the tactic was flawed but because the spirit of the attackers had been insufficient, because modern soldiers lacked the pure commitment of ancient samurai, because contamination by Western materialism had weakened Japanese warriors. These officers called for intensified ideological training, for stricter discipline, for purification rituals that would prepare men to die with proper mental clarity. They viewed tactical failure as spiritual failure, a problem to be solved not through better strategy but through more fervent belief. This internal debate within the Japanese military never reached resolution because events overtook it. As American forces continued their island-hopping advance, as each captured airfield brought bombers closer to the Japanese home islands, as the mathematics of attrition made eventual defeat increasingly undeniable, the philosophical question of whether Banzai charges represented honorable sacrifice or wasteful suicide became academic. Men would continue to make these charges, not because commanders believed they would succeed, but because the alternative, surrender, remained culturally unthinkable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.